Have the Russians opened a new northern front? Are they about to do something big, or is this a feint? And in fact, what is going on with the whole war, both at the tactical, operational, and strategic level? There's a lot of confusion going on and seemingly contradictory signals really coming out of multiple sides. And we have nobody better to try and untangle some of this than Colonel Doug Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice, former decorated combat vet and friend of the show. Doug, welcome back.
Yeah, happy to be here, Dan. By the way, I like your black jacket.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's kind of a black day. Just kind of feels like an appropriate thing to wear. So listen, I want to just jump right into this. I know your time's a little bit limited today, and we wanted to jump right into this big stuff here. So there has been some action over about the last 36 hours that make it appear that something, anyway, is going on in the northern part in the area of Sumy, separate from the Kharkiv operation that has been going on since the 10th of May. Here is actually military in summary channel talking about what's been going on over the last 12 hours.
Things, most important news are coming from Sumy direction. Today, the Russian sources, more precisely the Telegram channel Kadyrov 95, this is, let's say, official channel, Telegram channel of the head of Chechnya. And in this video, we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking the villages and settlements along the border. And based on this video, we can make a conclusion that the Russians started something in this direction. In the end of the video, we have an episode with the Russian soldier who raised the Russian flag inside of the, let's say, town hall of Ryzhovka, and also the Russians shown the sign of the town hall. And based on this video, most of the mappers have adjusted their maps, showing that Ryzhovka is under complete Russian control.
Now, so far, Doug, that's just one village that's right there on the border. So it's unclear if this is a big penetration, but Weeb Union actually suggests that there is something bigger going on in the region, whereas prior to this, Russia has started off basically de-electrifying a large portion of the area in this section, which could either indicate something big is coming, or it could also be a feint. And I wonder if you could talk about that on the backside of this video.
There are reports that the Sumy region is entirely without electricity or power. This means that this could be a larger operation, as this is a result of multiple strikes along the time of this war, but also it is likely a direct attack, whether it is a hacking attack or similar, where they simply cut off everything for a small period of time, where they try to disrupt all communication within the region to allow these Russian soldiers to make initial advances. We'll have more information once the situation has become clearer, and time will tell what has happened.
So first of all, Doug, I wonder if you can just tell us your best assessment of what this represents and what is actually happening in the northern part of Ukraine.
I think you're witnessing the sort of spring rainstorm before the flood. And this is really one of those shaping operations. It's going to contribute to the fall of Kharkov and the movement further west and north by Russian forces in the area. It's very clear right now that there are several things baking in the oven. One is what I just described. The other is coming south out of Belarusia, a potential buildup there. Well, actually, it is a buildup. And I think that they, at the right point in time, will sweep south and cut off Kiev. By that time, most of these Russian troops should be further west. Now, what's the point of all of this? First of all, if you know that you're winning, and that is clearly the case with the Russians, what are you concerned about? You're concerned about taking no unnecessary casualties. So the emphasis on keeping Russian losses very low is probably greater now than at almost any point in this war. Putin and his generals have been very, very concerned about the preservation of Russian life, more so, I would argue, than any previous Russian or Soviet military establishment in living memory. And right now, I think that continues to bother him. At the same time, you've got to look at the maps, look at the road nets, look where the rail lines are, look at the rivers and streams, and then you'll see that these shaping attacks make sense. So I think you're going to see something much larger and much faster in the near future, because he does want to wrap this up. The question is, as he wraps this up, what occurs in Kiev, especially when it becomes clear that the Russians are headed down towards it as from the north as also from the east. I suspect we'll see Zelensky packing his bags and leaving.
Now, it's ironic because from the Western perspective, and I want to look at what it at least on the surface appears to be almost contradictory information. One thing may look like it's something positive for the Russian side, and another thing looks like it's on the negative side for the Russian. For example, Bloomberg here published just a couple of days ago saying that Putin is really running out of time because he's trying to achieve this breakthrough. He made this incursion into the north part of the Kharkiv area on the 10th of May, and the claim, at least on the western side, is that he has bogged down after getting about 10 kilometers in these two areas, by Lipsy and Volchansk. We'll show that on the map in just a minute. That it's bogged down and now it's stopped, and the flow of Western aid has started to come through. Ukraine had a bunch of reinforcements that they moved up into the area and are now actually conducting limited counterattacks and are taking back some of the territory in the Volchansk city itself. How do you compare those things with the view that you just shared?
Well, I can't confirm the validity of those reports. I think there are several things at play here. First, I would be very suspicious of any claims of Ukrainian advances anywhere. What we get is evidence that Ukrainians are abandoning positions, abandoning defensive lines, abandoning villages, so that the Russians are not being compelled to fight very hard at all for any of it. Secondly, the Russians continue to invite and want more Ukrainian forces to come north and go east. The more they can bring up there, the easier it will be further south when they cross the Dnieper River. So the Russians have a lot of things on their minds at this point. Now, as far as our weapons are concerned, keep the following in mind. Chancellor Scholz, who is on very weak ground, obviously, has now made it very clear publicly, contradicting Macron directly, saying there will be no European ground forces in Ukraine under any circumstances. So I think that's very important, and whoever thinks the Ukrainians are gaining ground should keep that in mind. Macron has now acknowledged this. We are now admitting this. So they're no longer concerned about a direct NATO military intervention on the ground. They do look carefully at our air power. That's something that is always in the backs of their minds, and they are moving their integrated air defenses at every level forward very slowly, very deliberately, to ensure that all of their forces in the field are protected. But I think the notion that the aid that we are providing is somehow or another making a big impact is just ridiculous, unless you want to talk about the so-called strike systems that the Ukrainians are using against the civil population in Russia. It's killing Russian civilians in various places, but that does nothing to retard Russian military power, but it does a great deal to stiffen opposition to the Ukrainians inside Russia.
Now, one of the things which I think actually bolsters your contention in terms of what the Russians are trying to draw the Ukraine side up there because they want them to put their reinforcements up there. This whole attack in the northern part of north of Kharkiv originally was claimed by both the United States and Kiev intelligence as to having a force of Russian force between 50 and 70,000 north of that side of the border. But what we have seen is that thus far, only about 14 or 15,000 of those were ever employed. And there were engineering assets that were seen digging in, actually, after they got to that 10-kilometer plot, indicating that they weren't trying to go any further than that. And Gary, if you could throw that map up there, this is a current battle situation map that we have where there's also now anywhere between 200,000 and 300,000 Russian troops are reported to be north of the border. So one would almost wonder if the Russians were trying to capture Kharkiv so far, they would have employed more than just 14,000 of them. So I wonder if, based on what you see on this map right here, if there's anything different than what you said before, or if this validates what you suggest.
Well, it depends. I think it largely validates it because I know that the Russian general staff wants very much to draw in whatever remains of the Ukrainian army that wants to fight. They want to destroy it. And by moving towards Kharkov in particular, they're facilitating it, because what you don't see when you look at the mass of those troops are the enormous numbers of rocket artillery systems, tactical ballistic missiles, various drone batteries, all of which take their toll on the Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians have practically no air defense whatsoever. So this is from the Russian standpoint. Thank you very much. Continue to arrive in great numbers, and we'll put an end to this sooner rather than later. The Russians, as I said before, don't see any point in sacrificing any lives in any major assaults against prepared Ukrainian troops. The other reports that keep coming in from Ukrainians that are out there fighting tell us that they know there's nothing behind them. What I mean by that is that they know there are no defenses that they can fall back on. Now, this is a very serious and dangerous position to be in. This happened to the Germans, by the way, towards the end of the war. As they fell back, they couldn't prepare new defenses. There was no time for it. By the time they had established a weak defense line, within a few days, the Soviets arrived with overwhelming numbers. So I think the Ukrainians are now in a very similar position there. There's nothing behind them on the way to Kiev.
What might trigger this move? Because I could also show you, I wish I had loaded them up earlier. There's a number of videos that show large amounts of Russian armor in that area where that map was, where it showed these 200,000 actually up around between Sumy, Belgorod, right there in the middle there. You see that the Kursk Oblast, Belgorod Oblast, in those areas, there's been lots of videos of large armor formations that then basically disappear into the forest so that they can't be seen in large numbers. But in order to attack, or in order to launch something like this, there's going to have to be some kind of large movement at some point. Do you have any sense of what might precipitate that?
No. And, admittedly, there were times when I saw evidence for major offensive operations developing, only to be told it's not going to happen. And the strategic defense, which was the cornerstone of Russian military operations, certainly for most of the first 2 years, remained unchanged. I think you're going to see a change this summer. I think they'd like to end this before the fall. So my gut tells me that, all of this positioning, all of these shaping attacks and massing of forces all indicates that that's in the offing. One of the things I would be very careful not to believe are these assertions, once again, from Western media. Oh, the Russians are running out of ammunition. Oh, the Russians are running out of equipment. The Russians are running out of this. How many times have we heard that, Dan?
Yeah.
That's just not right. It's not true.
I remember the first 6 months of the war, every month I heard that the Russians are just about to run out of precision munitions, and it seems like instead they always got more. But here's one of the interesting things that I think is probably putting pressure on Putin to actually do what you suggest, because the longer this thing goes without some of those kind of moments, the more incentive it gives to the West to keep on putting a little bit more. And we saw this right in just the last couple of weeks with the Biden administration that says, you know what, let's actually just change the rules and allow Ukraine to start using our weapons to fire deeper into Russia, which in just the last 24 to 48 hours is actually having some impact. There's been an Su-57 that was hit deep in Russia, an ATACMS overnight hit 4, reportedly anyway, advanced air defense systems in the Crimea. And then here's what you had President Biden saying on the D-Day commemorations in France about what he's willing to do.
Let me ask you about what Vladimir Putin said last night about this authorization of American weapons inside Russia. He said the supply of high-precision weapons to Ukraine for strikes on Russian territory is direct participation in this war. He went on to say that this is the way to serious problems, and again talked about Russia's nuclear capabilities. Does that concern you?
I've known him for over 40 years. He's concerned me for 40 years. He's not a decent man. He's a dictator, and he's struggling to make sure he holds this country together while still keeping this assault going. We're not talking about giving them weapons to strike Moscow, to strike the Kremlin, to strike just across the border where they're receiving significant fire from conventional weapons used by the Russians to go into Ukraine to kill the Ukrainians.
Now, Biden seems to be saying, hey, look, it's no big deal. We're not talking about firing on the Kremlin. We're just talking about firing a little bit north into the Russian side of the border here. So it's no big deal. Putin's not going to do anything. What do you say to
First of all, the decision to allow strikes into Russia is not incentivizing anything. It's an act of desperation, Dan. We have no more cards to play unless we want to commit our air power. And if we commit our air power, flown by U.S. pilots, it's clear and unambiguous evidence that we're at war with Russia. Everything changes immediately. And we confront the reality that we could have tactical nuclear detonations at every major logistics base, airfield, airstrip, from effectively Latvia all the way down to Romania. So that's certainly not going to happen in my judgment. But, you know, it's irrelevant. These strikes are irrelevant. They're not attacking military targets. They are overwhelmingly attacking civilian targets in civilian areas, in neighborhoods, trying to kill Russians. We don't seem to be telling the truth about that. Of course, we're not telling the truth about much of anything either. But nevertheless, I think we should keep that in mind. As for underestimating or not taking President Putin seriously, we haven't taken the man seriously yet. I mean, for 20 years, he'd been making abundantly clear what Moscow would or would not accept in Eastern Europe, would never accept Ukraine as a member of NATO, would not accept the presence of NATO forces on Ukrainian soil, would not tolerate Western weapon systems, missiles, intelligence operations, or anything else, let alone biolabs on Ukrainian soil. And finally, he was pushed to the brink. And before he intervened in Eastern Ukraine, he also provided a proposal that we wouldn't even look at. You know, proposals at least deserve a look. Proposals are the beginnings of diplomacy and negotiation. We've never been willing to engage in either. It's either our way or the highway. It's a dead end. So I think it's a lot of bluster and nonsense, and it's not going to help matters. It's not going to avoid our embarrassment. It's not the way to avoid a war with Russia.
And what the ABC News correspondent there, when he was referencing what Putin had said the day before, this is the comment that Putin had said the day before.
Мы думаем на тему о том, что если кто-то считает возможным поставлять такое оружие в зону боевых действий для нанесения ударов по нашей территории и создания проблем для нас, то почему у нас нет права поставлять наше оружие такого же класса в те регионы мира, где будут наноситься удары по чувствительным объектам тех стран, которые делают это в отношении России?
Now, Putin actually emphasized on that, expanded a little bit earlier today in Russia, and said that so far he hasn't seen anything that would trigger him doing that, but said that he could. How do you interpret what he said based on what actually is happening on the ground right now in some of these things that apparently have been striking into Russia?
Well, I can tell you that the destruction of the early warning strategic radar, which was part of the Russian early warning system, was a good example of such a trigger. We're very fortunate that the Russians have not responded to that. That alone raises eyebrows because people assume, well, you're trying to destroy our early warning system. The next thing we should expect is a nuclear attack. So that's very, very dangerous. And I think something in that category is probably going to trigger. Now, keep some things in mind. First of all, nothing happens on the ground in Ukraine, or I would argue in most of Eastern Europe, that the Russians aren't aware of. Remember, they have space-based intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. It's very, very good. Secondly, I think it's very important for us to understand that we've had some strikes recently using hypersonic missiles in the vicinity of Lvov. We think 100 officers, NATO and Ukrainian, were killed in that. Now, we don't admit to the U.S. officers and support personnel who've been killed in Ukraine. We just don't admit it. The French have been embarrassed because it was hard to cover up. The British don't admit anything. Nobody wants to admit that they've got anybody on the ground there. But that was a signal. That was an underground facility. That was a well-known former Soviet Arab barracks and airfield and so forth. A big training hub for NATO and Ukraine. And they annihilated it, killing at least 100 and wounding another 200. It was a major, major strike. It's hard for me to believe that we are so stupid as to announce our willingness to strike Russian territory and not understand that what happened in Western Ukraine could happen in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Romania, Slovakia. And we need to wake up. These are not idle threats. The capabilities exist. And again, if he senses that we are going to mass air power, we've got 1,000 F-15s. Remember, F-15s are nuclear capable. And if they show up in great numbers and 600 or 700 and prepare to launch, I would expect those aerodromes, airfields to be lost. The Russians will target them. And the easiest way to annihilate them is with a tactical nuclear weapon.
And that's even the talk about that. And I could have shown you, but I think the next day, Putin, after making that comment about on the 5th of June, on the 6th of June, he reiterated that they have, nuclear weapons, that they have tactical nuclear weapons, and have a doctrine to use them. Again, just kind of laying the foundation that that's something he could do. But that doesn't seem to have effect on a lot of these warmonger, war lovers in the United States. And I hate to keep dragging him out there, but he's the one that's always put out there, and a lot of people do north and south when he talks, and that's Lindsey Graham, who over the weekend said, look, I think that we should just continue to, support Ukraine no matter what, because, they had this 10 to 12 trillion of critical minerals. So there's like cash for us to get. So let's keep going. And then he says this, which I really stuck out to me. Let's help them win a war we can't afford to lose. Let's find a solution to this war. Okay, terrific. There may be something on the ground there you think that we should go. You may have an aspiration for Ukraine to win. But when the fundamentals don't allow that, to continue going down that path is just, if not contradictory, possibly suicidal, if it could lead to nuclear war.
Washington, D.C., I'm talking about Congress and the White House. And I can't speak for the intelligence committee. The intelligence committee certainly seems to be working overtime to support this travesty and march to annihilation. These are people who cannot reconcile the world that exists with the world that they want. The world that exists right now, Dan, is a world that is increasingly turning away from us. It's not just Russia that is tired of being bullied and threatened by us. It's not just China. It's not just Iran, India, and about 120 other countries in the world have all made the decision to get out from under our financial system, to find a way to avoid trading in dollars. Now we know that Saudi Arabia has announced there will be no more petrodollar. I can't even begin to imagine the implications of that decision. When you look at all of these things, the reaction in Washington is punish everyone, bully everyone, do what you've done so far and continue to do more of it, as opposed to saying, well, this hasn't worked very well. Maybe it's time for us to change our approach. Maybe we should retrench. We're not as strong as we once were, certainly not today. All of those things, when you put them together, suggest that we should back away from this. And as far as those minerals are concerned, I can't vouch for that. I know that there is a lot in terms of natural gas and oil in eastern Ukraine. I know there are some rare mineral deposits in eastern Ukraine. I am unaware of what may be in western Ukraine. If he thinks that he's going to bomb the Russians out of eastern Ukraine at this point, then he's smoking a lot of crack in his spare time. It's never going to happen. And I think the Europeans have figured it out. And I think that's what you're seeing in the European elections. And I'm talking about your EU Parliament. People have said, this is it. We're not marching any further into hell. It's time to look for a stairway up and out.
Yeah, in fact, we had that. Gary, if you could throw that map up there. This is from the French voting on European Parliament. This is a remarkable image here. And just to kind of give people an idea, this is France, and the brown, I think it's down to basically county level or so. The brown is, quote, far right parties for European Parliament. And then, some of these other colors, and you can barely even see any of them, are for other parties. I wonder if you can explain the significance of what this signals, both in France and in Europe.
Well, first, keep in mind, anybody is far right who believes in enforcing the law, in preserving national identity and culture, in guarding national borders, and caring for, first and foremost, for their own citizens. That makes you someone to the far right. So you have to throw out that language right away. It's simply Le Pen and others like her who are winning because they've said, halt the denationalization, stop the open borders. We can't afford it. We're going broke trying to support all of these Africans and Arabs and others from the Near East who are pouring into our country. We can't afford it. They're going to have to go home. And I've had French officers tell me that they are prepared to refight the Battle of Algiers right there in Paris if necessary in order to get it done. I think tensions are very high. Now, why is France important? The great Metternich, who was the foreign minister of Austria, and then subsequently became Austria-Hungary, used to quip, if Paris sneezes, the rest of Europe catches a cold. Well, today that may not necessarily be as much the case as it was in the age of Napoleon or Louis XIV. However, the French are usually the bellwether because they are the first to rebel, the first to go into the streets, the first to reject authoritarian globalism and Marxism in that sense. The Germans, are very stolid, as are all the Germanic people, Scandinavians, Dutch, Austrians, and they're the last ones to go. But everyone is going to watch France. And I think when Macron holds his elections for the lower house, he's going to see a surge again on the right. The question is, as president, can he survive in office? There's nothing legally that can remove him. But that doesn't mean in France he could not be removed. So I think we're at the beginning of convulsive change in Europe. This really is the spring rain that precedes the flood. So stand by. Now, here's the bad news for all the Europeans, but this applies to us as well. Even when they get new governments and they're sick of the ones they have, most of these people have figured out this is insane. We don't want a war with anybody, least of all Russia. And they've seen their economies ruined by the sanctions that we've imposed. That's part of it. But I think what they're really saying is we are going to be Europeans. We are sort of renationalizing our countries. And this is something that I think all the people ruling us today in Washington and overseas fear. They are on the way out. They may not realize it, but the new governments that come in will not be able to do everything. So you may go through a couple of governments, and then the axe will fall. And you will see, I would argue, Cromwellian figures emerge who will do what these current parliamentary democracies cannot achieve.
Or will not. And in fact, and I know you're running low on time here, but in the last section here, I want to show something about John Mearsheimer, who's going to be on our channel here later this week. But in a recent interview, he was basically saying that there's still a chance if the people who are in charge right now do something that makes sense, they don't have to go over the edge yet, but we're getting really close to that. Check out how he puts it here.
The problem here is the threat of escalation. You're now talking about hitting the Russian homeland. You're not talking about hitting Russian targets in territory that used to be part of Ukraine that Russia has now annexed. You're back to attacking Mother Russia. And the Russians have made it clear that they consider this to be a red line. Now, my view is these attacks are not likely to be very successful, and therefore the Russians will not retaliate in any meaningful way. I think, however, if I'm wrong, and their S-400s can't shoot down these missiles and they begin to have a real effect, that the Russians will retaliate in a serious way. And of course, the great danger is that the West, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, will get dragged into the war, and you'll have a great power war.
So that seems to mirror what you said a second ago, that so far Putin has restrained himself from using these weapons, his own weapons, against Western assets elsewhere, which could, provide every opportunity to expand this war. But that's only going to go so far as unless we stop escalating it into Russia itself. Do you see that this is maybe a moment where we have a chance to finally do something that makes sense and seek a negotiated settlement? Or, and if we don't, we're going to go forward. And I'll just tell you, just before we came on the air here, actually, I was communicating with a senior Trump campaign advisor on foreign policy who said that Trump right now is leaning heavily towards if he wins, to immediately seeking some sort of a negotiated settlement to bring, to end the fighting and see if they can figure, ways to have any kind of a mutually acceptable deal, as opposed to doing what Biden's talking about here. So it could be that there's a shot to calm this thing down now or to escalate it. How do you see that playing out?
I don't see any change in Washington now in the foreseeable future, unless the Russians retaliate very strongly against us in Eastern Europe. And I'm talking about, as I said before, these key areas, logistical sites, airports, and so forth, even logistical nets that depend on rail. I disagree with John Mearsheimer, and I rarely do. The one thing that I disagree with here is he talked about we would be dragged into a war. Wrong, John. We've been dragging Europe into this war from day one. The Europeans now have second thoughts. They're scared. And in fact, behind this facade of solidarity, things are falling apart. Why do you think Schultz spoke and said what he did? Everybody else in Europe nodded their heads. No, we are not invading Russia. It's not going to happen. We're the ones that continue to provoke. We're the ones that are continuing to maintain, with British help, this corrupt puppet regime in Kiev, whose only mission in life is to either sacrifice as many Ukrainians as possible and to do as much damage as they can to Russia. And frankly, they haven't done much damage at all. Today it was announced that Russia has officially become, I think, the 5th largest economy in the world after Japan. Gosh, what a huge achievement for the Biden administration and his friends and stupid supporters in both parties sitting in Congress. They've made Russia a superpower again.
Yeah, and then add to that list the fact that instead of seeking negotiated settlement before the war even started in 2021, when there were at least 2 separate possibilities of reaching just a minimal negotiation that to keep Ukraine neutral and out of NATO that could have forestalled war altogether. Now that you've seen that Ukraine itself has been devastated, hundreds of thousands of men are dead that didn't need to be dead. And then on this strategic level, we've driven Russia and China together. We've put Ukraine, North Korea and Iran into the arms making manufacturing business to help Russia. All of these things are because we are foolish in our decisions, and it just keeps getting worse.
Yeah, I think that's a good summation. I have nothing to add.
Just makes me aggravated. It's things that are so self-evident and right in front, and we just can't make any kind of right decisions. And now we want to deepen
but
the
don't
problem.
hold your breath while you wait for the mainstream media to report on any of this. They're going to continue to lie prolifically about everything, because where do they get their inspiration? From MI6 and the CIA, who provide the various major papers and networks with narratives. These narratives substitute for truth. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of people who believe them. I spoke to some graduate students not long ago, and I was appalled. I mean, they hadn't read anything, hadn't studied anything. What they did instead was simply inhale and consume utter packs of lies about everything. It's depressing, but Europeans have done this. We've done this. It's got to stop.
Yeah, it's either got to stop because someone finally wakes up, or because we're going to be forced to stop, and that's what worries me about where that could go. Listen, Doug, I know you're going to have to run here. I wonder if you're going to tell us a little bit, because I know you, at least at Our Country, Our Choice, you may have some announcements to be coming up soon. I don't want to spill any beans, but I wonder if you can make a little mention about what you guys are doing.
Well, we're about to release a major platform for use across the country. It's going to first be provided to our members, but it will be available to others. And I think it's something that's going to have a huge impact. And I'm sure it will have such a huge impact and be so threatening, because it'll end up being perhaps the single most important free speech platform in America. And we call it Mission Control for Operation Save America. It's an information source. It's an opportunity for someone to sit down and has got the tools to contact every person they know in government above them, from the White House down to the county level, whether it's the county sheriff or a state senator or a local congressman, and send them messages, what they like and don't like, in any number of different forms. It gives them the opportunity to write their opinions and post them. and there will be no censorship. The only thing that we ask of anyone who joins this platform is that they be someone who loves America. If they don't love America, if they hate the country, well, we'd prefer they left. And if we see evidence for that, we'll eliminate it. But otherwise, people are free to express their views on any number of topics, from religion to politics to anything else. And we think this is vitally necessary if we're going to regain control of ourselves and our government. Free speech has to be a reality. Remember, free speech is still the best antidote to tyranny. And with each passing day, we see more and more evidence that the authoritarian globalists who talk about saving our democracy are really talking about destroying anyone who says anything they don't agree with.
Yeah, we certainly see a whole lot of that. And in fact, we have a guest on this afternoon who's going to be talking about that in David Sachs. In fact, if you guys want to come tune back in and watch this, you don't want to miss this. This is a big deal. David Sachs, the billionaire investor, is endorsing Trump. He went out on a limb there and just directly had a fundraiser for him in his house in San Francisco last weekend. A lot of backlash, a lot of success, and he's got some stories to tell you're not going to want to miss. Tune in this afternoon to see that at 2 o'clock Eastern time. And Doug, thanks ever so much for coming back on. Always, we appreciate your view and your analysis into these very complicated situations.
Hey, thank you, Dan.
And we thank you also. And we remind you one more time, we have a new feature here, a new membership where you can join and get exclusive content that everybody else doesn't get there. Some really good stuff behind the scenes. We had our first basically Q&A where we get to directly engage with you guys. It was great. If you join even today, you can go back and see that one and be aware for all the future ones here. Really great stuff. Get to see more of Gary out in front, which is really cool. A lot of people really enjoyed that factor, as did I. So it was really good. But we appreciate you guys joining us. We grateful for you coming in. Continue to join and subscribe if you haven't already, because we remain unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, whatever it is, because you deserve to know it. Thanks, and we'll see you this afternoon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.